Our second panel of the philosophy of gender. And our panelists today are Nathan Likert, Matt Rigilano, and Danielle Clarke. And we'll introduce them more in a second. Our timeline for today is, let's see if I can make this big. There we go. Our timeline for today is going to look much like previous sessions. A couple minutes of introduction from me and Olivia. Then we'll be hearing from our three panelists. So Nathan on Cavendish and the media of the mind, Matt on every several nothings, Cavendish and the not all, and Danielle on rethinking early modern gender. Then after that, we will have a 5-minute break to get our thoughts in order, start thinking about what breakout rooms we'd like to go to and what questions we'd like to ask while we're there. And we'll give you more specific instructions when we get to that breakout room moment. We'll spend about 20 minutes there. We'll come back for a large group discussion, Q&A with all of our panelists. And then hopefully we'll have lots of thoughts to kind of partially wrap up, but also hopefully keep running with and keep thinking about. So once again, Olivia is sort of the mastermind of this weekend sessions. So I'm going to hand things over to her to do introductions. Yes, I will mute myself, and Olivia, if you want to go ahead and introduce Nathan.
Sure. Thank you, Sophie. So first of all, I just wanted to say thank you everyone for being here on a Sunday afternoon, at least in Eastern US time. For some of you, I understand it's much later on a Sunday, so even bigger thanks, I guess. I think there's a lot of overlap between people who were here yesterday and people who are here today, so I won't repeat what I said yesterday, but I just wanted to say thanks and say that I'm really looking forward to today's panelists, and I'm especially looking forward to these talks because my understanding is that they'll be drawing some interesting comparisons and maybe contrast cases between Cavendish and other thinkers, which is really exciting, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say. So I'll let them tell you more about that and go ahead and introduce Nathan, our first speaker. Nathan Likert is a PhD candidate in the Department of Literatures and English at Cornell University, where he's writing a dissertation about literary character and the philosophy of experience in 17th century England. His articles and reviews appear or are forthcoming in ELH, MLQ, Postmodern Culture, and Post-45 Contemporaries. And today, Nathan will be considering Cavendish's play The Convent of Pleasure alongside the devotional practice of occasional meditation or reflection, as seen in Joseph Hall and Robert Boyle. So, Nathan.
All right, thank you so much for that really generous introduction, and thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited to share this with you, and I'm really excited this entire thing exists. This is just the ideal structure to talk about Cavendish. This is great. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I've got a PowerPoint here. So hopefully this goes off without a hitch. Okay, and PowerPoint slideshow. Okay, all right, everyone, we can see that? Okay, great. I'll go ahead and get started. To a 21st century reader, the work of Margaret Cavendish often surprises in its general neglect of that favorite 17th century topic, God. Indeed, this is much of her appeal, for Cavendish studies has exploded in recent years in large part due to her explicitly feminist version of vitalist materialism, refusing the spiritualized dualism of her male contemporaries. However, as this talk stakes as its basic claim, we might revise our account of Cavendish's religion if we shift our lens from the doctrinal to the practical, from theology to devotion. 17th century England underwent a major revival of affective piety as meditation manuals were printed and reprinted, patching up the frayed emotional health of a country torn by a century of doctrinal dispute. These manuals took the mind as their object, serving as technologies to isolate its faculties, hone their use, and unite them, reanimating a complete individual as God's agent, full of inward praise and outward charity. The devotional authors treated the mind like a resource to be carefully distributed and thriftily maintained, and scholars have tracked the influence of their cognitive pragmatism on the new science. Devotional manuals uncovered the spiritual meanings in such trivia of the natural world as a dog eating its meat or a burbling stream, much as experimental philosophy itself could find hidden atomic structure beneath the commonest object. This disciplined observation was about more than the knowledge gained, however. As Peter Harrison puts it, quote, "Natural philosophy is presented as a kind of devotional practice that will contribute to the moral and religious formation of the natural philosopher," end quote. Science was itself devotion, honing the mind and character of its practitioners. While scholars have traced the myriad ways in which Cavendish departs from the experimental philosophy of Robert Boyle and his ilk, especially in their presumption that technology could bridge the gap between us and nature, I will use experimental in the sense in which the term was most often used in the 17th century, devotional practice. In Joanna Picciotto's terms, devotion or, quote, affective piety can be understood in cognitive terms as a series of experiments in perception, understanding, and acknowledgement, end quote. Under this definition, many of Cavendish's works may be read as experiments, and that they seek to discipline a mind which was itself a potentially unruly commonwealth, composed of three jostling types of matter and the many ideas or fancies it contained. I argue that literature itself, for Cavendish, functioned as a media technology in the way that devotional manuals did, bringing together two different senses of media. First, they were physical objects which served as channels of communication, whether between author and reader, or between the faculties and ideas of the author or reader's own mind. Second, literature or devotional manuals mediated between these faculties or ideas in the sense of conflict resolution, an urgent function in a country plagued by civil war. Ultimately, the purpose of media is to bring disparate things together, which, as I'll conclude, offered Cavendish a means to reconcile the intrusions among female privacy by an invasive male public sphere. As case study, I take Cavendish's closet drama, The Convent of Pleasure, written while Cavendish was living in Catholic Europe, an environment that, as Sarah Mendelsohn notes, prompted her reflection on the many varieties of religious practice. The play concerns a young noblewoman, Lady Happy, who inherits a fortune from her father and uses it to establish a convent where unmarried women create a utopian society of collaborative pleasure. They live in harmony with the cyclical seasons and never lack for occupation or variety, free of the corrosive influence of men and the public world they control. The play's central question is whether a world without men, or more broadly, a world without linear time and the public world enjoining it, is possible. Eventually, a foreign prince disguised as a princess infiltrates the convent and falls in love with Lady Happy, and the queer energy of the initial seduction dissipates when the prince's true gender is revealed and the two marry at the play's end, with Happy leaving the convent to its uncertain future under the prince's beneficence. This question, how to live in a hostile world perpetually encroaching on individual, especially female, peace, is one that occupied Cavendish throughout her career, and her solutions often involved the creation of inward, alternative worlds. I want to suggest that The Convent of Pleasure, an explicitly metafictional play, and the closet drama meant for readers and not the stage, is itself one such world, functioning on analogy with the devotional practice of Joseph Hall and Robert Boyle to cultivate the mind of its readers and indeed that of its author. I'll proceed by staging the play's main debate, is isolation possible? And the links of this debate to contemporary questions about devotional practice and its uses. I'll then consider the failure of isolation in the play as outside forces relentlessly encroach on the convent and by implication on the mind, comparing this to Cavendish's own situation at the time she wrote the play. Finally, I'll consider one character in particular, the aptly named Madame Mediator, and the way she embodies the conciliatory potential of affective piety and its techniques. In a crucial moment near the play's beginning, Lady Happy delivers her manifesto for the fledgling convent, which, as the title suggests, retains the physical isolation of Catholic convents without the asceticism. Lady Happy instead invokes an almost libertine philosophy. Quote, "Can any rational creature think or believe the gods take delight in the creature's uneasy life? Or did they command or give leave to nature to make senses for no use, or to cross, vex, and pain them? For what profit or pleasure can it be to the gods to have men or women wear coarse linen or rough woolen, or to flee their skin with haircloth, or to eat or saw through their flesh with cords, unquote. Happy suggests that pleasure is a more primary value than God. It is our indubitable standard by which good must be measured, so any God worth his salt will condone it. Otherwise, he cannot be God. On that logic, Catholic mortification of the flesh makes no sense. Happy here recalls Joseph Hall, whose 1606 bestseller, The Art of Divine Meditation, urges the union of all men's faculties, mind, heart, and senses, in similar terms of relish. Quote, sight is of the understanding, taste of the affections. Neither can we see, but we must taste. We cannot know aright, but we must needs be affected, end quote. Hall figures the successful meditation as the entry of God into the soul, which then overflows back out into the world from its abundance, a process we see mirrored in Happy, whose social pleasure is divinely sanctioned. In this way, the work of meditation is conciliatory, mediating between the self, its God, the objects of its sensory world, and its feelings about them. It replaces the denial of asceticism with the fullness or plenitude, which spills over into action. But as we may expect, it's not so easy. While devotional practice promises the unity of the private soul and its earthly and heavenly homes, in the convent of pleasure, the outside world is figured as insurgent, an enemy ever at the gates of female tranquility. A troop of young male suitors desperate for Lady Happy's hand and the purse it's attached to, seek a means by which to broach the convent, of which, quote, there are no grates, but brick and stone walls. The walls are a yard thick, end quote. One suitor, the prince, successfully infiltrates the convent in women's clothes and seduces Lady Happy, leading her to marriage and departure from the convent. Not exactly a radical ending. However, it's worth noting that around the time Cavendish was writing this play, likely in the 1650s, she was also visiting England to sue for her estates back. Her characterization of this process in her 1656 autobiography, a supplication followed by vicious public rumor that she was a beggar, takes on the character of a primal scene. Quote, "'Tis true I went sometimes to Drury House to inquire how the land was sold, but no other ways. Although some reported I was at the Parliament House and at this committee and at that committee, and what I should say and how I was answered. But the customs of England being changed as well as the laws, where women become pleaders, attorneys, petitioners, and the like, thus trafficking with idle words, bring in false reports and vain discourse, words rushing against words, thwarting and crossing each other and pulling with reproaches." Cavendish is here just as unable to redeem her own domestic utopia, her estate, as she is her inward privacy, with a swarm of rumors creating a semantic chaos that she figures as almost physical in the thwarting, crossing, and pulling. This gendered complaint is ultimately about media. These wayward words, initially trafficked by human agents, are now independent, circulating without guidance. Yet, if Cavendish links the encroaching male public sphere with rogue media, the convent of pleasure finds within those very media a possible solution. The character Madame Mediator is, across the play, just that. She is less a character than a principal, as both Happy and the suitors employ her as go-between, such that her allegiances are impossible to discern, a medium detachable from its message. She embodies conventional wisdom, initially shocked at Happy's hedonist philosophy and gender nonconformism, and compliant with the suitor's aim to restore the sexual order. She herself, we discover, is widowed, meaning she knows what it is to interact with men, sexually and interpersonally, and yet she retains an independence. Other women lament that, quote, "they'll admit you, a widow, although not us, by reason we are wives," end quote. And as a widow, she boasts that she possesses an accumulated experience of a lifetime. Taken together, we have a figure who wants nothing personally and yet knows everything. If we return to our initial supposition that the entire play may be read as a mental exercise, we can see Madame Mediator embodying the cultivation of mental faculties promoted by the devotional writers. Regular contemplation of the ordinary world was supposed to become automatic, such that upon viewing a tree or the sun, the spiritual import would instantly leap into one's mind, as when we see a red traffic light and immediately stop. In this way, meditation bridged the gaps between the physical and the spiritual, as one instantly invoked the other, and between the faculties of the mind, understanding, affections, and will. To see was to know, was to feel, was to act. For example, in his occasional reflections, Robert Boyle claims that his skilled practitioners, quote, may have the satisfaction of making almost the whole world a great conclave mnemonicum and a well-furnished promptuary for the service of piety and virtue. Boyle imagines, unquote, Boyle imagines the entire world designed just for us, conclave suggesting a private language, a living memory palace of spiritual reminders. And yet really, it's not the world, but the mind that brokers this transparency of meaning. Frequent meditation is like donning a pair of mental goggles, coloring what and how we see, mediating our connection to God. Elsewhere, Boyle explicitly links his book to technology, as it offers a substitute or a shortcut for the observational experience that most people spend a lifetime accruing. Quote, this exercise of the mind must prove a compendious way to experience and make it attainable without gray hairs, for that, we know, consists not in the multitude of years, but of observations, from numbers and variety of which it results. Lady Mediator, I suggest, embodies the technologically produced experience Boyle is advertising, a connection crystallized when, concerned for the chastity and honor of Lady Happy, she herself cites a devotional manual. Quote, the advisor, 'tis piously said, truly, lovingly, and kindly. Nay, I have read the practice of piety, but further they say, he is a foreign prince, and they say they're very hot. Why, you are Madam Mediator, you must mediate and make a friendship. Odds body, what do you talk of mediation? I doubt they are two good friends. Well, this will be news for court, town, and country, in private letters in the Gazette, and in abominable ballots before it be long, and jeered to death by the pretending wits. But, good gentlemen, keep this as a secret, and let not me be the author. Bishop Lewis Bailey's The Practice of Piety, which first appeared in 1612, had reached over 40 editions by 1640, a popular saturation echoed in Mediator's own ability to circulate through contested zones in quest of harmony. Moreover, her fear of abominable ballots soiling Happy's reputation recalls Cavendish's own humiliating exposure in English court, and Mediator importantly stresses the media, letters, gazette, ballots, rather than their authors. Thus, even as she figures conventional gender politics, helping the suitors infiltrate the convent, she is also well aware of the consequences of such politics for women, who are always the object and never the subject of media. We may read her then as a conciliatory figure within Cavendish's own mind, putting the mediation in meditation. Cavendish, throughout her oeuvre, stresses the need for singularity in dress, style, ideas. Yet, her philosophical system insists that all beings are joined in a single continuum, and her social opinions often enforce a traditionally gendered view of female retirement, as we saw in her vexation at the unchivalrous customs of an England where women become pleaders. In this play, the queer and gender performative energies of Happy's affair with the would-be princess dissipate as the prince emerges to whisk Happy into traditional marriage. One essential question then, in reading Margaret Cavendish, would seem to be, in what way are her radical individualism and her attention to social and natural obligations reconcilable? While I, of course, cannot even begin to resolve this tension, I have argued that refocusing attention on Cavendish's debts to devotional practice allows us to, at the very least, recognize that Cavendish herself was well aware of the contradiction. Moreover, we have seen that she used the mental media produced and mobilized in the meditative tradition as one way of at least juxtaposing, if not resolving, the competing claims made by the senses, the intellect, and by others in the world. While I've focused on Madam Mediator, I'll end where the Convent of Pleasure does, with the jester Mimic, whose name invokes imitation or mimesis. This is what both literature and meditation do, duplicate the world within the mind, and in so doing, give that mind more to work with, more possible connections. Here is Mimic's epilogue. I dare not beg applause. Our poetess then will be enraged and kill me with her pen, for she is careless and is void of fear. If you dislike her play, she doth not care. But I shall weep, my inward grief shall show through floods of tears that through my eyes will flow. And so poor mimic he for sorrow die, and then through pity you may chance to cry. But if you please, you may a cordial give, made up with praise, and so he long may live. Mimic, invoking both the worlds of the text and of its composition, embodies the cognitive work of the play, by which the claims of others are incorporated into the self. Acknowledging the right of our poetess Cavendish to her privacy, Mimic nevertheless welcomes us into a virtual mediated space, whereby our demands on Cavendish the author, as the prince's unhappy, may be considered, and exchanges bartered. Perhaps this too, or this only, is utopia. Thanks.
Nathan, thank you so much for that. That was really exciting, and I really enjoyed how that tied into what we were talking about yesterday with patterning and thinking about sort of individuation and how you block off the self from other selves. So that was lovely. And I'm excited to hear more about nothingness and notchness in our following presentations. Let me turn things back over to Olivia so she can introduce our next panelist.
Thank you so much, Nathan. And I'm excited now to introduce Matt Rigilano, whose paper, Matthew Rigilano is an assistant teaching professor at Penn State Abington, where he teaches courses in writing and English. His research focuses on the theory of the novel, psychoanalysis, and 18th century forms of mediation. He is currently writing about the biopolitics of chit-chat from the early modern period to today. And today we will be hearing from Matt about Cavendish's tendency to identify spaces of exception, exteriority, or transcendence, and then integrate them into the philosopher's system through the mechanism of fancy. And I apologize for the disruptions there. My Zoom went full screen and I lost my bio text. But Matt, we're looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. It's such a great event, and I'm excited to toss some of this rogue media out there and see where it lands with respect to these other great papers we've been hearing. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, we can see this. Okay. I'll go ahead and start. So the name of the panel is Philosophy of Gender. My approach today, however, inverts these terms and could be more accurately said to engage a gender of philosophy, or more precisely, a sexuality of philosophy. Instead of looking to see what early modern philosophy says about sexuality, I hope to bring the formal resources of psychoanalysis to say something about early modern philosophy, more particularly the natural philosophy of Margaret Cavendish. My basic claim, and this is very speculative, so I'm taking a hint from Laura yesterday, very big claim followed by a close reading, but we'll hope it all works out. My basic claim is that Jacques Lacan's formulas of sexual difference allow us to describe a complex, but I think essential aspect of Cavendish's ontology, or perhaps I should say the evolution of her ontological framework. While I do not explicitly make the argument here, this paper implicitly suggests that Cavendish's thinking of gender and sexuality does not only transpire in her explicit remarks on the roles of men and women, but also in the dialectical movement of her philosophical output, which I think was something Olivia said very kind of clearly yesterday. So there's certainly no time for a thorough explanation of Lacanian theory, so I'll try to be very brief and describe just a few relevant concepts. I'll mention immediately that for Lacan, sexuation has nothing to do with biological sex, nor does he think it is entirely a matter of social construction. Rather, he argues that the fact of sexual difference indicates that there are at least two ways to have one's desire alienated in language. Those that occupy the masculine position are all in with respect to the symbolic. That is to say, their desire is fully subjected to the law of the signifier, to language, to the social link. But paradoxically, there's always an exception. the fantasy that there is at least one exempt from the strictures of the law. So to occupy this position is to be fully alienated in the signifier. A totality is possible, but only on the condition of an exception. The feminine position for Lacan is not all with respect to the symbolic. This does not mean that there is some transcendental material that the symbolic has left behind, something wholly outside it. Rather, it means there is a surplus. Like men, women are fully alienated in language, but it does not thereby form a closed totality, which would require an exception. Rather, this position implies an open set, not in all with an exception, but in all comprised of exceptions. That which resists the totalizing law of the symbolic is, according to Lacan, ineffable, but that does not mean that it cannot be written. In fact, Lacan indicates that the logic of the not all opens the space of poetry, a writing that pushes past significance to access the materiality of the signifier. So, very brief and hopefully clear enough sort of delineation of some of the concepts that we're going to be kind of putting into play here. So to return to Cavendish, at several points along the arc from atomism to innated matter to the tripartite coexistence of rational, sensitive, and inanimate matter, we can observe various figures that occupy ambiguous or liminal positions with respect to her philosophy. Immaterial spirits, vacuums, God, nothingness. On the one hand, we might conceive of these figures as exceptions that give totality a promise of closure. And indeed, God sometimes, is obviously a contentious sort of thing, God does appear to be the one thing that is accepted from Cavendish's various systems, unlike Spinoza, say, who integrates divine transcendence into the heart of immanence. But on the other hand, these figures sometimes appear to trouble the all or the totality from within, to push against it, not to subvert it, but to supplement it, to render the all indeterminate. Vacillating between the poles of sexual difference, we might take up Cavendish's term for hybrid creations and describe these figures as ontologically hermaphroditic. So, for example, in the 1655 Philosophical and Physical Opinions, there's a short prefatory essay entitled A Condemning Treatise on Atoms, where Cavendish directly rejects her earlier commitment to Lucretian atomism. I'm going to read the second sort of part of this little essay. Here we go. But this opinion of mine is, if the infinite and eternal matter are atoms, but I have considered that if the only matter were atoms, and that every atom is of the same degree and the same quantity, as well as the same matter, then every atom must be of a living substance, that is innate matter, for else they could not move, but would be an infinite, dull, and immoving body. For figures cannot make motion unless motion be in the matter, and it cannot be a motion that sets them at work without substance. For motion cannot be without substance or produced therefrom, and if motion proceeds from substance, that substance is moving innately. But if motion is nothing, then every several nothings, which are called several motions, are gods to infinite matter, and our stronger nothing, which is every stronger motion, is God to every weaker nothing, which is every weaker motion. For if motion depend upon nothing, every particular motion is absolute. With some tongue twisters in there, really. In this passage, we see Cavendish make a case for what she would later refer to as self-moving matter. The problem with atomism, she claims, is that it does not adequately account for motion or causation. Without an internal vitality, the world of atoms would necessarily be reduced to an infinite, dull, and immoving body. Cavendish argumentation for this point is elaborated later in the text, and of course throughout her philosophical work of the 1660s. But here, the argument is really quite strange. She begins with something like a reductio ad absurdum by ironically entertaining the conditional identity of motion and nothingness, if motion is nothing. Motion is nothing because for atomism, causality can only be located outside the atom, in a vacuum perhaps, or as the result of the clinamen, which is a nothing that Cavendish really doesn't address anywhere. even in her earlier work. Oops. So she continues after making this identity between motion and nothing. If motion is nothing, then every several nothings, which are called several motions, are gods to infinite matter. What is remarkable here is that instead of simply noting the absurdity of a motion that is nothing, she takes another step towards mobilizing and multiplying the nothing. So every motion we observe in this scenario contributes to a collection of nothings. Because nothing is outside the universe of matter, it takes on a transcendental figuration here. The nothing is also a god. Moreover, because some motions are stronger than others, we have to suppose that there is something like a hierarchy of divine negations. Our stronger nothing, which is every stronger motion, is God to every weaker nothing. Finally, Cavendish concludes the exercise. For if motion depend upon nothing, every particular motion is absolute. The argument here shifts to some degree. Motion is not identical to, but is said to depend upon nothing. The consequence is that every motion is sovereign, which by definition is dependent on nothing. So this reading of the argument repeats a basic point in Cavendish scholarship. The turn to vitalist monism was driven by a desire to account for material causation more adequately, which for atomism could not be established without recourse to the immaterial, the absolute, or the impossible. But there's something more going on here. To begin with, those every several nothings, as imaginative fancies, are not exactly nothing. Rather, they might be considered as hermaphroditic figures that reside at the very limits of the philosopher's system. Let me try to elaborate this point. So first, the multiplicity of godly nothings amount to more than just a parody of atomism. Indeed, atomism is said to involve no motion at all. Without innate self-moving matter, we'd have nothing but an infinite, dull, and immoving body. And so the exercise tries to imagine what causation would have to be without self-moving matter. The result is neither atomism exactly, nor her fully developed system, but a strange fancy, an irregular figuration that sees reason dip into the resources of the imagination. Second, we should examine the ontological status of these philosophical curiosities more closely. In Philosophical Letters, Cavendish writes, you may say a man hath sometimes improbable or impossible fancies, imaginations or chimeras in his mind, which are nothings, or sort of stylized as no things. I answer that those fancies and imaginations are not nothings, but as perfectly embodied as any other creatures, but by reason they are not so grossly embodied as those creatures that are composed more sensitive and inanimate matter, man thinks or believes them to be no bodies. Indeed, for Cavendish, these fanciful imaginings, those every several nothings, are not nothings. Rather, they are simply the product of rational substance, which consists of the least gross matter. In this way, those divine nothings of the reductio are not nothings, but fancies, which, as voluntary creations of rational matter, are said in this same volume to, quote, depend upon nothing. They are not absolute, as all matter is intermixed, so they are things, but they are nevertheless free, somehow outside the universe of occasional causation. And this tension between materiality and the impossible is precisely what is at stake for what we might call Cavendish's dialectic of the not all. Sort of just to end here. In the world's Olio, Cavendish claims that a true poet is like a spider that spins all out of her own bowels. Of course, the reference to spinning here immediately recalls the opening lines of Poems and Fancies. True it is, spinning with the fingers is more proper to our sex than studying or writing poetry, which is the spinning with the brain. But I, having no skill in the art of the first, made me delight in the latter. Similarly, in conceiving of how writing relates to the logic of the not all, Lacan asks us to consider the textual work that comes out of the spider's belly, its web. He goes on to say, It is truly miraculous function to see on the very surface, emerging from an opaque point of this strange being, the trace of these writings taking form, in which one can grasp the limits, impasses, and dead ends that show the real acceding to the symbolic. I think what Lacan means here is that the opacity of being, that which is not all with respect to the web or language, can be figured forth as a kind of textual materiality. And I would suggest that Cavendish's webs reveal similar opacities or excesses, because those curious figures, those arachnid nothings, thingly but free, are not just thoughts in Cavendish's heads or ours, but written. And as written, they signify nothing but themselves, not all, but certainly not nothing. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. That was a lot of intellectual heavy lifting for a Sunday, but it's good. I just need a little more coffee to process it all. And while I process, I would love to introduce our third speaker. So Olivia, let me just pass this back to you real quick. And we're going to hear from Danielle Clarke next, as soon as I get this up. There we go.
Okay, thank you so much, Matt. Danielle Clarke is professor of Renaissance language and literature at University College Dublin. She has published widely on gender, sexuality, and women's writing from the early modern period. She has just finished editing with Sarah C.E. Ross and Elizabeth Scott Bauman, the Oxford Handbook of Early Modern Women's Writing in English from 1540 to 1680, and a section editor for Theories and Methodologies for the Palgrave Encyclopedia of Early Modern Women's Writing, edited by Rosalind Smith and Patricia Pender. She's working on an edition of the poetry of Lady Anne Southwell and researching a monograph, Becoming Human, Women's Writing, Time, Nature, and Devotion from 1550 to 1700. And the talk that we're going to hear today is related to that project. So Danielle's presentation will argue that early modern women poets use the account of creation and fall in the book of Genesis to question and unsettle a binary model of gender and gender roles, resisting the biological determinism that later readings embed. So Danielle, over to you.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen there. Everybody see that okay? Well, thank you to everybody for the invitation. It is well after dinner time here. As I was saying to the others, I have just eaten a rather large roast dinner, so the idea that I would engage in abstract thought is possibly a little challenging for me right now. But thank you very much for the invitation, and I've greatly enjoyed the presentations both yesterday and today, which kind of touch on some of the issues I want to talk about in a variety of ways. I was just thinking particularly about, Olivia's ideas about kind of poetry, thinking, and philosophy. So a lot of this paper really is kind of asking some questions about the form in which this kind of thinking takes place. And Laura's discussion of the animal and human is also very relevant to what I'm doing here. I'm very taken with Nathan's account of meditation and ideas about meditation. In fact, he's just sort of kind of summed up in 2 sentences the argument of my book, I think. So maybe I should just hand it back to him. And Matt's piece as well. I'm still getting my head around the various configurations of nothings, but I'm very interested in this kind of idea of hermaphroditic figures and spinning and textual work and various other things. So we can try and pull all of those together. I should also say there's very little Cavendish in this paper. In fact, as it turned out, I kind of ran out of time for her. But I'm hoping that in the breakout rooms afterwards, we might talk about the Cavendish poem and how that might relate to some of these questions. So, okay, so this talk then traces a line of thought in relation to the creation of sex and gender roles from Du Bartas through a selection of 17th century women poets. I want to suggest that the dyad of Adam and Eve, both their creation and fall, provides women writers in particular with a powerful authoritative example with which to think through ideas about what sex is, what gender is, and the extent to which these are in fact opposites within a binary matrix. Very briefly, I suggest too that observations of the natural world, du Bartas's Divine Weeks is the ultimate compendium of knowledge, lead women to ask searching questions about the animal-human boundary, which is a key philosophical question, and about the mobilization of this opposition as a way of reinforcing or indeed challenging socially determined gender roles. I have a long kind of preamble about, women reading du Bartas, which I can share with you in another context. The importance of du Bartas had been almost entirely overlooked subsequent to Anne Lake Prescott and Susan Snyder's pioneering work on his poems in the 1970s and 1980s. Sarah Ross, Gillian Wright, and Elizabeth Scott Bauman, among others, have noted the importance of du Bartas to 17th century women devotional poets, with Ross noting, quote, the variety of du Bartas's influence in the first half of the century. She puts forward a strong case for du Bartas's direct, if diffuse, influence on women's poetry, asserting that all divine poets of the 17th century owe something to du Bartas's harnessing of secular verse forms to sacred subject matter. And this reminds me again of Nathan's arguments as, quote, a digressive, copious and various retelling of scripture, providing a framework on which women can structure their own responses. And she demonstrates this specifically in relation to Southall, Poulter and Hutchinson. Formal imitation is important. We might read Lanier's Salve Deus Rex Judaeorum as a Bartasian poetic commentary on the Gospels, or Southall's Decalogue poems as imitative of du Bartas, or Bradstreet's imitation of verse forms from Sylvester and her use of the quaternion as manifestation of this engagement. Du Bartas is not so much a paraphraser of scripture as a contextualizer and enlarger of it, adding subsequent insight and knowledge to the end of asserting the universal inclusivity of the divine creation. The world, in his famous if conventional formulation, is a book which directs readers how to interpret the physical world as the manifestation of the divine. So this is from the 7th day of the first week. You actually have this copied out in the pack, which is a little bit easier to read. So here we find a material reading of the earth as, quote, dear mother, which may then be understood to impart key lessons. The natural world provides moral examples for human beings to imitate, a powerful means by which ideas of origin and orientation might be interpreted and understood. Quote, O earth, the treasures of thy hollow breast are no less fruitful teachers than the rest. This framework is crucial then when we turn to readings of the creation of Adam and Eve. Like many early modern accounts, du Bartas frames his reading in terms of sameness, not difference. So there's a little bit here about prelapsarian reproduction as being based in similitude rather than difference. Thenceforth, therefore, bears engender, the dolphins, vultures bred, men, and nature with a changeless course. So men is this sort of weirdly kind of prelapsarian homoerotic idea of creation, which I'll come back to. So the point here is about sameness rather than difference. Adam and Eve are not opposite parts of a dyad, but rather rooted in a common body. And this is, of course, a model of sexual differentiation that's ultimately confirmed by modern science. So here, he took a rib which rarely he refined, and thereof made the mother of mankind. This is identified by, it's only identified by female by role, by mother. Adam's beauties, but hardly one could have the lover from his love descried, or known the bridegroom from his gentle bride. It's about non-differentiation. And then this is my favorite version of this, where he says, his other self, his help, him to refresh, bone of his bone, flesh of his flesh, source of all joys, sweet he, she, coupled one. And this is du Bartas or Sylvester's interpretation of du Bartas with the very powerful hyphenation there as well. So I want to explore briefly the way in which four poets, Lanier, Southall, Hutchinson and Cavendish, respond to du Bartas's strongly materialist reading of the scene of the fall, suggesting in turn that this model provides authority for all four poets to question and reframe a reading that depends on sequential hierarchy, namely the notion that Eve is lesser because she is creative after Adam, and secondly, on a fixed gender identity located in the apparent stability of corporeal sex. For Lanya, for example, metaphors of the book as food and ownership of luxury objects abound in Salve Deus Rex Judaeorum, reminding us again of the interpenetration of the material and the human, and the ways in which this serves or may serve to reposition or rethink aspects of the patriarchal gender binary. Lanya's defense of Eve depends crucially on the fact that she is materially identical to Adam. Quote, if any evil did in her remain, being made of him, he was the ground of all. It is post-lapsarian hindsight that introduces the idea of hierarchical differentiation based on sexual difference. Quote, for he was Lord and King of all the earth before poor Eve had either life or breath. And this is an interpretive model also embraced by Southall and Hutchinson. Lady Anne Southall asserts that a rigid hierarchy based on gender inequality is, quote, a perverse, resolved and willful heresy. This is my very badly annotated and much used copy here. This is why we need an edition. Her unpicking of the sequential model found in one biblical account is underlined by the way that the poem works backwards through the biblical account, starting with Genesis 2:22 and ending with 1:27. For Milton, of course, these questions of primacy and sequentiality, fused with classical models of sexual difference, trace Eve's secondariness and thus inferiority back to the ontological signifier of the body. By contrast, Southall focuses on those verses in Genesis which contradict such ideas of temporal primacy and moral secondariness. Woman's origin in this account is identical to that of man, and Southall suggests that woman is the perfection of man. Questions of female virtue or morality are referred back to the male body. Our bodies are as gold taken from your earth, and so are of a more refined birth. From that red clay where Adam did reside, precipitated and well dulcified, God took a marble pillar and did build a little world with all perfection filled. The marble pillar, as in Dubartas, is Adam's rib, but the female body, through the language of alchemy, is represented as the refinement of the male. To dulcify is to purify from acidity, to sweeten, to soften or mollify. Southall goes further, again drawing on the Geneva commentary on Genesis 5:2, male and female created he them and blessed them and called their name Adam in the day that they were created. Quote, by giving, and the commentary is, by giving them both one name, he noteth the inseparable conjunction of man and wife. Throughout, Southall's focus is on the equality of men and women as outlined in the scriptural account, and the way in which that authority, expressed in the sacrament of marriage, means that both share the same fate. This is the position, of course, that Adam has to arrive at in Paradise Lost. Thus, the gender divisions suggested as a willful heresy are the result of fallen human nature, not divine imperative or design. Now, Lucy Hutchinson is the writer most obviously indebted to Dubartas in terms of her conceptualization of the functions of authorship and the poetic processes of her text. Order and Disorder famously incorporates scripture as an integral mode of representation. In Book 3, the impact of Dubartas's account of prelapsarian reproduction on the basis of homology is clearly referenced. Quote, every bird and every beast its own resemblance in its female viewed, and only union with its like pursued. And a little bit further on, in union likeness only feeds delight. Animals, Hutchinson suggests, reproduce through similitude, not difference. Adam finds no such mate, an insight which is a pretext on which to base some ideas about human superiority, notions of laughter and song and so on. Quote, there was not a second of his kind endued with such a form and such a mind as might alike his soul and senses feast. And then no meet companion, thinking them too base for the society of human race. Once again, echoing both Dubartas and Southall, no doubt partly on account of their common scriptural sources and commentary sources, Hutchinson's Eve is made from Adam. Notably, the gendered possessive pronoun is attributed to God rather than directly applied to Eve. She is my better self, my flesh, my bone. They are, quote, late of one made two. And Hutchinson's use of the Hebrew name Isha underlines similitude. Julie Crawford's powerfully argued recent account of Hutchinson's quote, this is Crawford's quote, indifference to any ontologically meaningful status for human sexual difference, suggests that her version of the creation account is less a recuperation of Eve, who in her account indeed bears some responsibility for the fall, than a rejection of the terms of sexual differentiation upon which their unequal status rests. We might think in the discussion about Cavendish's poem of Sense and Reason and its extension of the idea of this kind of permeable boundaries between apparently distinct states and entities, and this fits in nicely with what Matt was talking about, I think. Okay, so just to kind of sum up where my thinking is going with this, I think too often we've assumed that women have read Genesis through the dyadic model of sexual differentiation upon which patriarchal thought depends, even where we've read women's interpretations as resisting that or trying to overturn it. Rather, I'd like to suggest women poets demonstrate an investment in a much more complex, fluid, and mobile notion of gender that asserts that women's authority derives not from the body, but from their shared and equal humanity. Thank you.
So like we did yesterday, maybe we could start by just hearing from the moderators from each of the groups. And then if someone, sparks more discussion, we can just sort of go with the flow. Who should go first? Arno, do you want to go for our group, or should we start with a different group?
Actually, yeah, Melanie was our moderator. Do you want to chime in?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Absolutely. So our group talked about the meaning of the absolute and then ended with the idea of what is dissolution, and came to a general conclusion that for Margaret Cavendish, there is no nothing, and there is also no sort of hermetic totality. And as we thought about these issues, we started to think more aggressively about what does Margaret Cavendish think her works do once they enter the real world. Matt had sort of phrased this in terms of what does she think happens when this is put in language and other people read this language? What happens on that level? Whereas I was a little bit more curious about how she sees writing to function in terms of bringing new ideas into, which are going to be irregularities because they're brand new, into a regular order. What function does she think her writings affect on society? Does she write just to be famous? Does she write to have some sort of intervention? Does she just write to give pleasure? And how does she think the mechanics of this work? We didn't have a clear answer. We had some ideas. It was very lively.
Thank you, Melanie. I didn't get a chance to say this in our breakout group because our discussion was so animated, but I will take the opportunity to say right now that I think with respect to like what Cavendish thinks her texts could do, it seems to me telling that she, after publishing PPO and then publishing it again, right, she like went and read a bunch of philosophy. And then, even though, as Laura in our group was saying, she never completely bows to like the genre conventions of 17th century philosophy, she does sort of try a different strategy. She says like, I have gone and read a bunch of other philosophers, and now I think I can express myself more clearly than I did before, even though I think my ideas are basically the same. And in philosophical letters, she like uses, I don't know if she uses these or how they came about in the editorial process, but there are like citations in the margins, right? So it's like, you can go and check to see, did she really engage with this other person? And to me, that suggests that she really did want people to read her writing and then think for themselves. And she says this, like, you can use your own reason to sort of test out my ideas, but I think I'm right. I think she did think she was right, and she wanted other people to think she was right. So I don't know how that intersects with fame. It certainly can be related to fame, but it seems to me to also be somewhat distinct. So that was my thought on that question. I don't know. I don't want to monopolize if other people want to respond to any of the things that Melanie mentioned, but also we could hear from another group. So we could go either way.
Just throw onto that, Olivia. thought that was really well put. There's an interesting idea that in the work itself, like Cavendish is often trying to be an example of the thing she's talking about, right? So if it has to do with the production of novelty in a sort of in an infinite monism, this would necessarily be a kind of tense thing to do, because on the one hand, as you said, like she wants to be read, she wants to be understood, she wants to be celebrated, but on the other hand, in order to say the thing that makes her work singular, she would have to say it in a way that would always risk being unintelligible, insofar as it would be the production of an idea or a signifier that wouldn't have like a clear referent in any kind of sort of prior system or text, and so it's always those little singularities wobbling around in the systems that I think everyone finds so fascinating in her work.
Yes, absolutely. I have a lot of thoughts bubbling up in my mind, but I will move on. So I see someone has a hand. Karen?
Thanks. I have really more of an idea to throw out there, and that is I've been reading Catherine Larson's book on song and early modern women's writing, and I wonder if, in response to what you were talking about, Melanie, if we might even think about the ways that, so Larson talks about song in Cavendish's work and her discussion of the way that hearing happens. And so I wonder if we can, I said this in the chat yesterday with regard to convent of pleasure and the idea of a closet drama, is it helpful to think about her readers reading aloud? So the idea that people were reading aloud in this period a lot more, and I wonder how that might help us to think about how she conceived her readers receiving her work.
I think that's really a great aspect to bring in, Karen, the idea that it's not just visual recognition of prose done in isolation, but can be a group activity where there's not just the hearing, but there's also the interpretive level of somebody speaking it and then receiving it that gives an extra degree of mediation to it. And this may not exactly correlate with your point, but with the aspect you've opened up, but one of the suggestions or one of the things that I have brought up in our group was why literature is a way to become famous when there are so many other ways to become famous. Why does she choose this? And when she talks about fame, she doesn't talk about other writers, she talks about Alexander and Caesar. So there are different roads to fame, and there are different ways to ingest, to have the impression come in.
Especially in context of Nathan's paper, right? The fact that so many women writers are choosing devotional writing and theological writing as the avenue to fame, or even prophetic speaking. I mean, the number of avenues that Cavendish does not take up that she could. We had about a year ago a whole panel on Margaret Cavendish and Maria Sibylla Merian, the later kind of insectologist who becomes world famous for her writings and more importantly, her paintings. You'd think that Cavendish, I don't know, she stays in Rubens' house. Couldn't she just steal a few techniques from Rubens and become a good painter overnight, or at least give it an attempt, and then, go on from there? There's so many avenues she could take. Nathan, I'd be curious for your thoughts on this point.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. I mean, it seems like the only tentative answer I could give is just that there must be something special about creation, about fiction as the making of something new. I mean, and so many scholars have pointed out the way that imagination and creativity are at the essence of cognition for Cavendish, that all sensory knowing is a kind of patterning or figuring of the thing you're trying to know, right? Rather than like reaching out and touching it, right? So there does seem to be a way in which, creation is sort of the fundamental, which is also in a way copying, mimesis in some sense, copying of some model or some prompt, is sort of the fundamental thing that all matter and all beings do. So it does seem like, the idea of making things is really at the heart of what Cavendish, perceives as her particular ability. I mean, she says at one point in her autobiography, she's like, I was really bashful, I was very melancholy, I liked hanging out with myself in my mind with my fancies, because they just run around and they're ultimately harmless. But even there, she's imagining her fancies as sort of companions, as things that are there inside of her, right? And maybe in the same way that she imagined her readers. So it does seem like there's, you probably have to think about the affordances of fiction itself and what it is and its relation to her philosophical system.
I'd just like to follow up on that point, because I think I was very struck with Nathan's kind of points about meditation, and particularly this particular form of kind of affective meditation that sort of starts to become prominent in the 1640s, 50s, 60s. And of course, I can see its kind of appeal for somebody like Cavendish. It doesn't necessarily actually have to be a religious meditation. It's a process of taking what might be a very quotidian object and turning it into a thought process of some kind, often effective, but not necessarily. And I think the other thing that just kind of relates to Nathan's response about making is that those meditative practices are all about iteration. They're all about the idea that what you do is that you create a meditation on something that you may then return to as if it was written by somebody else. It's not actually necessarily, it's not personal. I mean, it may only be written in manuscript, but the idea is that you produce something that is iterable in some way. And it seems to me from the things that I'm hearing that Cavendish is so interested in these kind of interconnections and the way in which things turn up from one place in another place. And whilst so I can just kind of see that there's some sort of conceptual and kind of formal kind of parallelisms going on. So I'm just kind of interested in that iterative thing more than anything else. But I think his points are all good. It's great. Thank you.
I was wondering if I could maybe follow up on this.
Matt, I was just about to call on you. Sorry.
Oh no. I was going to ask Nathan a question, kind of in those, on these topics as they are sort of floating around right now. The idea of the devotional is really interesting. I don't know much about early modern devotional writing, and I was thinking about what devotional writing itself, like as a practice, would be like, or how that might bear on this. I mean, when I think of devotional writing, I think of the sort of the church fathers in the desert, writing, but writing in such a way that it's hypnotic and by rote, and so there's no meaning attached to it in a sense, right? Just the accumulation of marks that one needs to perform as a kind of, in a ritual mode to mediate the distance between themselves and God. And so the media itself becomes, interestingly, to again follow through on some of these threads, illegible, right? That's not what it's about. It's about the writing. And I wonder if if you see a connection between sort of devotional practice and sort of the practice of writing itself, if that makes sense.
I think definitely, yeah. I think one way to think about this is through the actual structure of the play, The Convent of Pleasure. So we talked about this in our room, but most of the play is taken up with a kind of series of genre experiments where they're in the convent. The princess is seducing Lady Happy and they're frolicking. And there are a series of different kinds of plays. There's one in which, various lower class women talking about the ways in which their husbands are ruining their lives, basically. So you get a kind of city comedy, but in a tragic vein. There's a pastoral scene, there's a masque. So it seems like in that sense, Cavendish is interested in genre as media, but specifically in the way that, genre can bring up something through its, kind of productive constraints. It sort of forces you to think along certain preset or predetermined lines with predetermined roles, predetermined affective responses, but just the heterogeneity of them and the quickness, the speed with which they dissolve and transform seems to imply that, for Cavendish, you can almost imagine her writing one of these scenes and then seeing its limits or getting bored with it or seeing the ways that it ends up constraining its protagonists as much as it ends up liberating them. So I think Cavendish is very much interested in this idea of a genre system and the way in which it does or does not allow the kinds of conclusions or the kinds of liberating thoughts that she wants. So I think you would, the devotional practice is similar. Joseph Hall and Robert Boyle are both saying, I'm giving you one method, but I'm not going to do like those Catholics did, where they're like, concentrate on the cross for 32 hours and then consider the logical, ways. It's very much like, whatever you want, like meditate wherever you want, bring your own practices to it. I'm going to give you some suggestions, but ultimately it's about the way that your own mind makes connections and constructs a kind of private language through the prompts that you're given through the text. So I think that's one way of thinking about it.
Super interesting. Thanks.
So I see that Laura has a hand, and then I do also want to hear reports from the other breakout room moderators, just so we can all know what everyone was discussing. But Laura, why don't you go before we do that?
Oh, I just had a very small idea about, I realized when Matt and Nathaniel were talking about painting, I just realized, oh, hold on, in Cavendish, there is the tripartite matter, and the rational matter is the architect. So it's not like painting is done without any involvement of the rational matter anyway. And ultimately, it does seem to suggest from the metaphor that she thinks that the space of creativity somehow will start from the rational matter. And maybe that's one of the ways of thinking about the writing, why she chose writing.
Yes, thank you, Laura. Sergio, would you like to report on your group's discussion?
Sure. Many things have been said already, but basically we had a brainstorm with different ideas. I started with the City of Ladies, because when I read Cavendish, The Convent of Pleasure, I had already read the City of Ladies, and for me it was so similar. At some points, there was a kind of contamination of ideas between one and the other. But obviously that was a hard question for Nathan, who didn't have the chance yet to have a look at that. Nevertheless, we had some other questions, fortunately, about the completion techniques and contemplative practices, since Nathan considers the contemplation for Cavendish is dangerous. And correct me anytime if I'm wrong, right? And then we talked about drama as an education tool for the women at this time, right? We're talking about obviously a closet drama, a play that was not supposed to be on stage, and the experiment that we are witnessing when we read the Cavendish, this Cavendish play. After that, we came across several ideas like the sexual politics, cross-dressing, and what that meant at the time, and mimic. And what else? We came up again with the idea of what Cavendish is trying to tell us with this play, what he's teaching us. And finally, the last idea I had noticed was that Cavendish take philosophy ideas to put them into practice. I consider this idea very interesting because it's something that I see regularly in women playwrights all over the time. So to take their philosophical ideas, to turn them into tangible things, not just the idea, but something that you can metaphysically touch, right, in the end. And I will close my report with one question. How much can you be focused on your own pleasure? Something that has been said in this group. If I forgot something, Spencer, Lynn, Nathan. All right, that's it.
No, I would say, thank you, Sergio. I think that you encapsulated that really well. We talked about so many different things, and like Arno was saying about the having so much fun in the breakout rooms. We covered a lot of different materials. One of the things that, this is a personal interest of mine, of course, I'm always interested in thinking about Cavendish as a pedagogue or an educator. And so one of the points that Seth brought up in the discussion was, to what extent is Cavendish what is she trying to teach us in her various texts, and how does she go about doing it, right? So he drew a comparison between the physical experiments that she sort of criticizes in observations and the thought experiments that she's very actively sort of doing in her own work. And I think this is something that a lot of us have already talked about here. So I guess one thing, I will ask a question and then I will back away slowly. And this also ties back to what Arno was saying yesterday about her paratextual materials, her prefaces. And so my question to all of you, when thinking about Cavendish as a pedagogue, how does she alter, I'm going to read from my notes so I don't mess this up. How does Cavendish alter her rhetorical strategies and self-presentation based on the genres in which she is writing? What connections can we draw between her deep and abiding concern as a woman writer and a natural philosopher and her goal to teach through her texts? And then finally, how do we read the sort of complex relationship between Cavendish and the other women that she's writing to, writing about, writing for, both those who precede her and those who may be her readers? I'll point at Olivia first and foremost, but anyone, absolutely anyone can answer and I will take diligent notes.
This is almost sidestepping those really great questions, which I think are important. But one thing that's been on my mind since we were talking about fame in our breakout room is like, how do we know what Cavendish wanted to do with her texts? Like, how do we know she wanted, I think the adopting the lens of pedagogue in thinking about her, I think is really interesting, but I think that it also kind of needs justification. And so I was wondering if you could explain a little bit how are we justified in, and I'm sympathetic to this, but how are we justified in kind of giving her the label of pedagogue?
Yeah, and I mean, it's definitely not in the language that she uses. So we were talking a little bit about if we try to do the very difficult and daunting task of reading across her entire corpus and looking at all of her prefaces and sort of drawing them into conversation with one another, right? She tells us explicitly that she wishes she could teach, that she would teach if women were allowed to speak out loud, but she can't. So she's going to go ahead and write it out. She also tells us that if people don't understand her work, it's because they're not reading all of it. They're not reading it closely enough. They're not reading it correctly. And so in some ways that sort of, those sort of statements give me reason to sort of push the envelope and say, just like Cavendish pushes things to the logical extreme when she's doing her own thought experiments, what happens if we push our arguments about her to the logical extreme? And so I just go for it and say feminist pedagogue, knowing very much that it's contentious. So thank you, Olivia, for bringing that up. And I, of course, would love everybody's thoughts on this.
It doesn't look like we have a lot of time, though, so yeah. I'll switch with David. I'd like to hear what he would have to say here.
Oh, yeah, it's speculative a little bit, of course, in response to E's question. But I mean, she does say things like in the preface and the epilogue to Blazing World that she doesn't get to have a world of her own that she wants, and so she creates this alternate world. And the ant people and the spider people, they all want to talk to her about math and talk to her about things that other people won't talk to her about on Earth. Then there's the line in the preface to Philosophical Letters where she says, it's so striking to me, a philosopheress is not made in an instant, but you've got to have interlocutors. You've got to be part of the larger institution of philosophy, have correspondence, have training in the lingo and such. And then she says in her natural philosophy writings how much everything is so interdependent. You know, the seeds and the sun and the plants and the soil, things are causally interdependent on each other for what they are. And so I find it hard to not think that when she's creating these worlds and when she wants to put them orally, right? Put them as many modalities as possible. She wants them to register. And that one thing she really wants to register is that when she fails to be a philosopher or a scientist or a navigator, she talks about this in some texts too, she's really pissed, right? She says, it's not because of my status as a woman, it's because of the guys, the men, and how they block us. And they don't block Descartes, they block the women. She creates these worlds, I think, to exhibit structure and to show what a world would look like where women can do all these things that show that it's not the talents of women that keep them from doing the things, but structures. And She Anchored, I think, is one of my favorites, right? Because that's a world where it's an alternate world where she talks through this great, and she has these audiences of people lining up to want to hear her, and she can be influential in ways she isn't on Earth. But there's others too. There's Sansparel. There's the Blazing World. There's all these stories, and so that's one reading, I think, of what she's trying to do to imprint these worlds, so that people can inhabit them, and so they can live on in future generations and maybe have an impact.
Friends, I have a terrible job of calling the time and setting those of us for whom it's very, very late to bed and or not. But Liza is extremely angry at me, but she can't stay angry for too long because she knows I'm right and we have to stop. This has been actually genuinely terrific. I've covered more notes out of just the topic of philosophy of gender in these last 2 days than I think is. I think my wife is going to be happy at me. Like, the notes are literally on my desk. I've stopped writing on paper, just started scrawling it into the wood. I hope this was wonderful for you all. If there were links or other excerpts or sites or things like that you wanted to drop in the chat that would be helpful for us in the future, or for other people who are going to view the recordings at the end of these various talks, please let us know and throw those in the chat now. If there were other questions you were hoping to pose and you wanted to get answers to, also throw those in the chat now. But if I'm not mistaken, I think we need to call it a wrap and really just thank the speakers, thank the leader of all this, Olivia. It might be worth mentioning, Olivia, I hope it's not too personal, but just 2 weeks ago, Olivia got married. So she tackled this entire project while also tackling a marriage in the middle of COVID. So we're extremely delighted for her, really very pleased. And this brings the Olios to a great wrap. I'm going to give the microphone to E and to Sophie for any last thoughts, and then we'll give it to Olivia to say farewell.
The one thing I wanted to jump in to say really quick, sorry.
You're great.
As we continue to develop these and tweak these for the future and think of future topics, please keep an eye out on your emails. I'm going to send you a link to a really quick survey where you can just let us know what you liked, what could be different or better, and suggest any future topics. Your feedback is really, really helpful to us, since some of this is a great vivacious group, but sometimes it's hard to read the room when we're in Zoom. So please tell us what's working, what's not working, and I'll send that out to you right after this.
Yeah, I will just say very shortly, this was brilliant. Thank you so much, Olivia, for this hard work, and for the panelists who presented just an incredible amount of research. Danielle, there were so many questions I didn't have a chance to ask you, so I will probably follow up by email. And then, of course, I said this in my breakout room too, but just on top of what Sophie said about providing feedback, we're always looking for future chairs. So if you have a topic that you're just like dying to like dig into with Cavendish, please like be watching for our calls, because we're always trying to draw in more people and more energy. And this has just been such an incredible experience. So definitely thank you all for being here on a Sunday afternoon of all things.
Olivia, any last words?
Oh, just words of thanks. I mean, this has been a wonderful experience and I've learned so much and I have so many new ideas to pursue. So everyone here, don't be surprised if you get an email from me in the coming weeks with questions and ideas. So apologies in advance if that happens. But yeah, thanks to my fellow panelists. It was just a really fun, eclectic and thought-provoking session, I guess 2 sessions. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.